Welcome to Grieving Insomniacs. This is your host, Cristi Habermann. So today I wanted to talk about the holidays. I am very surprised that I had such a difficult time over Easter this year. It just kind of snuck up on me because I've been so busy at work, probably burying my head in the sand a few times. So Easter pops up on me, and I realize that I'm kind of angry. Everybody makes this big hype out of being together. My younger son was out of town, so we were really truly alone for Easter. And it's been 12 years. Well, it'll be 12 years in June. And I am so still heartbroken because Christopher isn't here. And I've been talking about him a little bit more just in general with people. And it makes them uncomfortable. I can tell when I tell stories about him and they just don't know what's coming. And it's just really kind of sad. My dad is in town. We all know the story of that and how that goes. He wasn't really interested in spending Easter with us anyway. And we also had a snowstorm and, various things for Easter. But it was just kind of surprising. And the holiday that I dread the absolute most is coming up, and that is Mother's Day. And I wanted to talk about Mother's Day. Again, there's just so much work that needs to be done to bring awareness to people about being a grieving mother. And just for giggles, I decided that I would do a Google search on how to cope with Mother's Day. And I found two articles, one from Canada and one from the UK, that directly referencing how to cope with Mother's Day. One of the ones from the UK that I found very interesting, it said, don't plan anything for Mother's Day. I'm like, what? That is the exact opposite of how I cope with Mother's Day, which is I make Christopher a part of my life always. So at every holiday, I acknowledge him in some way, and I want him to acknowledge us. And we do get some spiritual signs around the holidays. And Mother's Day is a particularly tough one. So a little family history there. Like, grief doesn't happen in a vacuum. How we grew up, how we cope with the world, what's been role modeled for us, our cultural upbringings, all of those contribute to how you experience your grief. Mother's Day was particularly tough when I was a kid because my mom was never satisfied with anything. She wanted expensive presents. She wanted flowers. She wanted to be taken to dinner. And all of those things are fine, but not at the expense of everything else. And she'd get so mad at my dad because he was more of a practical kind of guy and gave her a waffle iron one year. We still, it's not funny, but it's funny, laugh about the chaos and the screaming and the yelling that happened that Mother's Day when he gave our mom a waffle iron. So in our house, when I was growing up, Mother's Day was awful. Awful. And we just wanted to run away and hide. I got my first job at 14, and I remember buying my family presents for Mother's Day because I was trying to avoid the chaos that comes from Mother's Day. And how do you go to school, as a young kid and tell people about the things that happen in your house? And they're talking about, we went to dinner, or their moms cooked a big dinner, or their dads cooked a big dinner for the moms. There was no screaming about how come she didn't get a diamond ring and how he didn't love her. And oh God, it's just chaos. I cannot even describe the chaos that occurred during Mother's Day. So that's how I grew up. Then I became a teenager, and even in the same house, me and my mom were estranged. We weren't really in sync with each other. So oftentimes I was left out of the Mother's Day celebrations. And I think probably it's due to money. She only had enough money for her and my sister. Sometimes my brother went, but most of the time he was absent and with his friends. So he'd go to his friend's house and have Mother's Day celebrations over there. And why that was acceptable to my mother, I'm just not exactly sure, but it was. And so then my mom and my sister would go out and celebrate Mother's Day, and my dad lived in a different town, so I was often home alone. But I also worked. I worked a lot when I was a teenager. So when I was a teenager too, I started getting left out frequently. My mom got family pictures taken. I wasn't in them. The hurt that comes from that is just unbelievable. So then I had Christopher, and for the first time, Mother's Day became enjoyable because I was a mother, and I was in control of Mother's Day. And me and Christopher would celebrate Mother's Day, and I do things simple. Then I got married. My husband is military. He often had to work, especially in those first few years. He often had to work on Mother's Day, but that was fine with me because we would celebrate at home. And I love cooking for my family. I guess that's one of my love languages, is that when I cook for you, that's a demonstration of how much I love you. And I would do that. And so it wasn't so bad, Mother's Day. And then it became more and more obvious the older I got, in my 20s, in my 30s, that the major holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, Mother's Day, that I wasn't going to be included. It didn't matter if I lived in the same town. It didn't matter. I just wouldn't have been included. It's like somehow I was not a part of the family. So my conflict with Mother's Day goes way beyond just having Christopher die. It's one of the most conflicted holidays that I have. Well, Christmas and Thanksgiving might be worse, but it's right up there. And I would wait to see if this would be the year my parents would come see me, because my dad didn't either. He wouldn't come see me, neither would my mom. And they used the excuse that my husband was in the military and we lived in California, we lived in Louisiana. But I know as a parent I would have done anything to get. So I mistakenly believed that when I moved back to South Dakota after my husband retired, that pattern would not continue. But it did. And then Christopher died. So because of that history of Mother's Day being so difficult, and then for the first time when Christopher was born, I had a family. I was a part of a family. It was my family. First family I'd ever had. So when he died, I was absolutely devastated. Like devastated. It's like my whole reason for living had gone away. And here it was, no longer a mother. Like, that was a major struggle for me when I was trying to grieve Christopher. It's because I was trying to understand, am I still a mother? Because it all started with Christopher, and Christopher defined it all. And then Colin got married, and his priority became his mother, his, wife, mother. And I would just cry the first week before Mother's Day after Christopher died, waiting for someone to invite me to Mother's Day. I didn't care if I joined another Mother's Day. I wanted to be a part of Mother's Day. I wanted somebody to celebrate me as mother. And it just didn't happen. It just did not happen. And then about 4 years ago, I decided that I was going to not wait anymore. That I was taking back control and going to have the Mother's Day celebrations that I want. So, if I want to buy myself flowers for Mother's Day, I do. If I want to go out to dinner for Mother's Day, I do. If I want to buy myself a card, I do. I was no longer waiting for someone else to acknowledge me for Mother's Day. And it's just heartbreaking when I think about it, because what I've learned doing this podcast and what I've learned being a counselor is this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. If I'm experiencing something like this, there's someone out there that has a similar story to what and that's why I talk about this. And my mom's dead now. That's a whole nother story. Her anniversary's coming up. Maybe we'll do a podcast about that. But she's dead now, but that pain still exists of not being included in these celebrations. So along with Christopher's grief, I think that's also part of why these holidays are so hard. Because after Christopher died, no one wants you around. They don't want to invite you because you remind them of their worst nightmare, which is one of their children dying. And maybe you're a little sad and they can't handle that you're a little sad. So I have a feeling that more often than not, grieving mothers are alone, especially if their children are older. It's different if your children are at home and you have to put on that brave face. So maybe it's not until you get in the shower at night that you cry, or in the morning, or you're up in the middle of the night thinking about how much you miss the child that's not in the family. And that's what made my search on Google so interesting. So we have these podcasts about grief. And one of my, I shouldn't say complaints, because people ask me when I say I have a podcast, oh, so you interview people that tell you how to recover from grief. No, that's not what I do. I talk about what it's like to be grieving because I'm interested in the stories. And people must be interested in my stories. I haven't been broadcasting nearly as much, but my promotion I got at work is over in the beginning of May, and I hope to be back to a weekly schedule. And I talk about the stories because the stories is where the healing is. So when I read that on the Google and it said to not talk about it, that is the complete opposite of what I recommend as a grieving mom. What I appreciate more than anything is having family and friends listen to me tell stories about Christopher or to talk about what it's like to be grieving. I promise you my family does not listen to my podcast. And to be fair, I don't tell my friends about my podcast because I'm very vulnerable on these podcasts, but I am not in person. In person, I don't talk about what it's like to be a grieving mom. And I did talk about it the other day, and they all got these shocked looks on their face. And I said, okay, enough of this conversation. Don't even get me started on it because you're not going to like what I have to say. And sometimes I wish that I was brave enough to do a TED Talk because I really believe people need to hear these stories. People need to hear what it's like when people turn away from us. And I wish people would quit quoting Kubler-Ross's stages of grief as the way to cope with grief, because it's not. We all have to find our own ways to cope with grief. So on Mother's Day, I do my memorial stuff, which is I take something out to Christopher's grave. I'm lucky our graveyard lets you put statues, different things around the grave. And so I take something out to the grave. I also take a spirit plate of their favorite foods out to the grave. That's a tradition I borrowed from the Native Americans in our local area. And I just pretend like even if he can't eat it, he understands the love that went into making it for him, because that's my love language. And I'll sit there for a while and take pictures of the sky and just miss Chris. And then I just do things to take care of myself. I have Christopher music that I listen to. I haven't completed my Spotify podcast with that, but I plan to have a Spotify playlist for Grieving Insomniacs. And when I listen to his music, it just makes my heart hurt maybe just a little less. And this year, Kai the Wonder Dog died last June. It's been really tough without her here lately also. I don't know if I just buried all my feelings about her dying, but it's been pretty difficult getting through Easter, and it's going to be difficult for Mother's Day. And the reason being is that Kai was my best friend through my grief. She was just always by my side, providing me comfort, and I just miss her terribly. She did come see me in a dream recently, and it was good to see her, and she's happier. She can move around now. For those of you that are new listeners, Kai the Wonder Dog was also a host with me and would sit at my feet while I did my podcast, and also while I did my counseling. And she also provided a lot of, and I'm convinced that she could see spirits. but she is greatly missed, especially during this time. So one of the things that I would recommend to people that are going to have a tough time over Mother's Day, the first thing is to take care of yourself. Now, if cooking for everyone is your love language, then cook a big meal and invite everyone. That's my love language. I would like nothing more than to have people at my house, but it's also distracting, right? I'm busy cooking and planning, and that keeps my mind off of the fact that Christopher's not. But if you don't want to, then don't. And you got to plan a little bit for it. Like, I would not wait until the last moment and then be wandering your house from room to room to room trying to figure out what you're going to do. This takes a little bit of planning. And so you got to think about what gives you comfort. What gives you comfort when you are thinking about your deceased child? I moved Christopher's pictures home from my office at work. And it's one of the best decisions I've ever made, because now he's in my office when I do my podcast or when I'm watching TV. And sometimes, I know this is just on the weird side, but sometimes I just pretend or imagine that that's him sitting in the room with me watching TV. And it brings me comfort. So that's what coping with Mother's Day is bringing you comfort. So if it's a special meal, if it's going to the grave, go sit at the grave. Here in South Dakota, it's been warmer here lately, but we often have cold Mother's Days. Sometimes even snowy Mother's Days. So it's hard to get out to the grave when it's nasty like that. But you still can go out to the grave if it brings you comfort. I found a company that makes t-shirt blankets, and that's one of the things when Christopher first died in 2011, I sat down to make him a quilt. And I cut up all the squares and did all of the stuff. And I got halfway done, and I'm not a sewer, and it did not work out well. Not at all. So I found this company that I plan to send all of these t-shirts to. And then I'm going to have a quilt made. And after I make that quilt, when I'm missing Chris, that's what I'm going to do, is wrap myself in it and pretend like he's hugging me. Because it's all about me having comfort. Not someone else, but me. For some people, isolating is better on Mother's Day. That's fine too. There is no right or wrong way to do any of this. It's you trying to figure out how to cope. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I tried to make my podcast different than every other podcast that interviews people. Because I firmly believe, through my own experiences and the experiences that I have talked to others about, that finding a way to cope with grief is an individual journey. And it's a solitary one. That's why I named my book The Solitary Journey Through the Loss of a Child. Because each person has to find out what works for them. And we like to believe that grief is something that we can put in a little box, and then we can have someone prescribe something to make us feel better. And it's the farthest from the truth. It's so far from the truth. Because I read those articles, some of them just made me mad. So I was like, what if people actually follow these instead of thinking about what's right and good for them? And it may end up hurting them. I just wish people were more cautious when they try to prescribe, in quotes, on how to fix something, because it only can be fixed individually. And so, like, using me as an example, is my traumatic history with Mother's Day 100% contributes to what my grieving style is on Mother's Day. Because it was already traumatic. So if your mom died young, and then you lost a child, Mother's Day is going to be twice as traumatic, because you lost your mother and you lost your child. So it's grief upon grief. If you're estranged from your mother, like I was, and then you lost your child, that feeling of loneliness can just overwhelm you. There's so many scenarios that you can get into with this, where it's important to learn what things impact your grieving. Because we all have a story. We all have a history. And our history matters. that history matters when it comes to grief. So I see these memes on Facebook and other places where it says the key to moving on is to not think about the past. And I absolutely do not believe that. The past defines us and shapes us. So in order to know who you are, you need to know how your past shaped and defined you. And it's not a matter of casting blame. It's a matter of understanding self. What things influenced me in this situation? What cultural customs influenced grieving? So we didn't have any in my family. I think I've shared this before, that we never had any tragic deaths or major cultural customs surrounding death. So when Christopher died, I was clueless on what to do. That's one way that you can talk about it. So the other thing is areas of the country do it differently, whether you're religious, all of these things impact how you perceive your grief. And it's important to know those and important to figure out how those events are affecting you right now in this moment. So having training in counseling has really conditioned me to being able to do this. But I promise you, you don't have to go to a counselor to understand how your past affects you. It's helpful, but you're going to have to redirect the therapist. Because most therapists I find when you go to them in grieving want to stick with the 5 stages of grief. And actually they need to look at it in a more holistic view, which is how was I shaped? What life experiences are shaping this grief? And how those are impacting how I'm grieving and where the blocks are. So my block was definitely being a mother. That's another reason why Mother's Day is so particularly difficult. And Easter, I was just angry. Still don't understand why Christopher had to die. I really struggle with it still, after all these years. And it doesn't help. I went to the doctor not that long ago, and I think I talked about it the last episode. But when the doctor tells me that I need to go to counseling, because I'm still grieving, I don't know why they think that counseling will fix it. Counseling is not going to fix anything. We are going to be sad. We can learn how to cope with it. But to expect us to never be sad again is unreasonable and unfair. And I think psychologically unhealthy. And that's just my opinion. Other people may have different opinions. But then I would like to hear them, because I want to hear other people's stories. Because one of the reasons why I started this podcast is because I wanted people to know, this is what grief is like. This is my story. This is who I am. And I'd like to know who you are too. So thanks for listening. This is Cristi from Grieving Insomniacs. I'm not sure when I'll be able to post again. My detail is over, my promotion on the 5th of May. That next week I should be back on a regular schedule. I am traveling the 1st of June. We'll have some podcasts coming out of then. So we got some things coming up. Christopher's anniversary date is June 19th. His birthday is May 27th. Those are all good. And then it's over for another year. So thanks for listening. This is Cristi Habermann signing off. And you have a great day and a great week.